This is the Legree-Carouge duel, December 29, 1386. This is what, of course, the movie The Last Duel is about. It is taken from a book of the same name, which I really recommend you read. It's a great little book, and it'll give you a feel for the whole story. Let's just get right to it. Jacques Legris and Jean de Caron, both of them of the household of Peter, Count d'Alencon, and esteemed by him, but more particularly Jacques Legris, whom he loved of all others and placed his whole confidence in him, from Froissart's Chronicles. That's how he begins. Froissart is the one who first tells us about the duel. And this is a much more serious matter because it is about an accusation of rape. And this was a combat to contest charges of rape made by Jean de Carouge, a Norman knight, which he brought against his neighbor and previously good friend, Jacques Legris, on behalf of Jean's wife, Marguerite, who was pregnant and could not swear whose child it was. Now, I guarantee you that that's what they will play up in the movie. However, as you'll see, this is a side story to the affair. Because the question of paternity in the Middle Ages vis-a-vis rape is, let's just say, primitive. And I'll show you how primitive in a moment. All right, so here's the trick of this story. We have two men, longtime friends, and what you have to understand about the whole precursor to it is it's about one guy whose life is doing this while another guy's life is doing that. And the truth of the matter is that one of them is incredibly charming, and one of them is Jean de Carouge. Okay? Carouge was from, we'll talk about his life in a little bit, but he had a reputation for a bad temper. He had a reputation for suing neighbors, for suing business associates when things didn't go his way. He had a reputation for failed financial dealings, and by the time this duel comes about, and this guy's in his 50s when it happens, he is not well loved by almost anybody in the Count d'Alencon's court where he serves, and he had already had a falling out with the Count, who was a young Count, was very enamored of Legris, and basically considered Carouge like a obnoxious country bumpkin that he had inherited, but who was useful because he was really good at killing things. Okay, and because of that, the setup for our story is that when this whole case breaks, he doesn't even get a fair hearing from the Count. He does get a hearing. I say he doesn't here, but you'll see he does. But then he goes to the French Parliament and he is rebuffed, and then the King of France, Charles VI, known to history as Charles the Mad, however, only 25, 24 years old here and still seemingly sane, hears the case and decides that no, the Parliament is going to hear it. Okay? And eventually what happens is that they agree that they will hold a field, they will grant a field in Paris. First, they decide to hold it in late November. Then they decide to hold it right after Christmas. I'll explain why when we get there. But here's the catch. Marguerite, not just Jean de Carouge, has to stand as a mutual plaintiff. So remember under the Italian law in that cartello I wrote where Dave told Jesse that, you know, on top of that, he's making insults to a woman who cannot even defend herself. Okay? So this is going back to the old idea of champions, of judicial champions. And so it is saying that the husband cannot just bring the plaint on his own account, but his wife has to be the plaintiff as well. And that means that if her husband is guilty, she is guilty. And if her husband is executed, then she is executed. So basically, what the court is trying to do to force an agreement, or what the Parliament was trying to do, was say, okay, yeah, you want to call this guy a rapist? Are you willing to risk your life for it? To which Marguerite says, yes, absolutely. This duel was attended by much of the highest French nobility of the time, including Charles VI and his family, including a number of royal dukes. In fact, he moves the date so that more people can attend. And indeed, Charles is coming right off of the death of his first son, infant son, and he essentially decides to use the duel as a distraction from the country's mourning by making it a post-Christmas special event. I kid you not, okay? So it was attended by thousands of ordinary Parisians, and in the ensuing decades was chronicled by such notable medieval historians as Froissart, Jean Juvenal de Racine, and Jean de Warren. Legree's insistence on defending his case by chivalric trial by combat rather than opting for the safer church trial, to which as a cleric in minor orders he was entitled, attracted widespread support for his cause amongst the French nobility, and controversy continues to this day as to where the real guilt lies in the case. So that's a summary of why everybody cares about this duel. Now let's see who these guys were. So, Jacques Legree. He was born in the late 1330s. He was godfather to son by a prior marriage of his then close friend, Jean de Carouge. He was described as large and physically imposing with a reputation for being a womanizer. He was a feudal retainer to Count Pierre d'Alencon and a favorite at his court, gathering a large swath of his liege lord's territory in addition to his own ancestral holdings. The Legree family were minor nobility, and Legree was fairly poorly placed other than one manorial fiefdom, so basically one manor house that he was going to inherit from his father. However, he was bold in battle, charming, clever, and the young count really liked him. And this allowed his prestige to grow, and the count kept adding privileges and holdings for him to govern. So as the count gained other lands, or as some lords died without direct heirs, the count would take them into his own property, and he didn't give them to Legree as lands, but he gave them to Legree to manage for him. So he's essentially like a sheriff for him, okay? And basically what happens is, over the period of about a decade, while Carouge is increasingly overlooked, Legree is rewarded for her services to the count, and then finally, what really starts to lead all this to a head is he's granted a newly purchased estate at Anneux-les-Faurons. And Carouge became jealous of his friend, and the two men soon became rivals at court. Okay, so that's Jacques Legree and how things are seen through his side of the story. From Jean de Carouge, he was born about a decade earlier, and he was the eldest son of an influential man who had been rewarded for long military service in the first phase of the 100 Years' War with a knighthood and the title of Viscount of Belém, a rank that came with a hill castle, as well as carrying significant financial and social rewards. As I said, Jean is known for having a bad temper, and he's also known for being hot-headed and very short-sighted in pretty much everything. Sometimes that's useful, though, and it did give him a reputation, much like Legree, for being an incredibly brave warrior. And when he did eventually die, it was after a 40-year military career in which he served in Normandy, Scotland, and Hungary with distinction. Despite these successes, however, a number of financial woes, some of his doing, some not, continued to spiral his finances downward. By the time of the duel, he is coming off of one bankruptcy and about to hit a second. So, a year after entering Count Pierre's services, Carouge's first wife and his son, the one that Legree was godfather to, both die of unknown but natural causes. Carouge leaves home and joins the service of Jean de Vienne, who is a sea admiral in the 100 Years' War, and he establishes himself fighting at sea against the English. He then goes on several adventures as a mercenary, but being loaned by the French lords to the Scots. France has a ill-fated campaign trying to help the Scots fight the English to get English attention away from France. He participates in that, and he essentially builds a small reputation as a captain at arms. However, even that doesn't go well for him, because he also has a reputation amongst common men of being this guy who achieves all these things for his lord, but his men all get killed. And I mentioned here that there's this 5-month campaign where half of his retinue were killed in battle or by disease. And there's repeated things like this that occur. And so anyway, for him, perhaps the big is when he meets Margaret de Theobald. I think I just pronounced her name wrong, but you know, it's French and that's not my strong suit. So Marguerite's family is wealthy, and they are not as well placed in title as Carouge, but they have a lot more money, and this is a common thing. So he basically is able to make a deal to get this young, very beautiful wife in return for the idea that her family's prestige will be raised by inheriting the Carouge name and title. One of the things that her family has owned and that should have gone directly to her is the estate at Anneux-les-Falcons. In fact, it should have been part of the dowry. However, while Carouge is away fighting, the Count gives it to Legris. It is believed that it is the fight over that estate that is what leads to the two men having a falling out. So, now, that happens about a year before the event that we care about. There's been about a year of bad blood between these guys. They're both in service to the same lord. Once again, Carouge is called away to fight overseas. And once again, Legris is kept close to court. And then this happens. Jacques, who was a strong man, held her tight in his arms and flung her down on the floor and had his will of her. Immediately afterwards, he opened the door of the dungeon and made himself ready to depart. The lady, exasperated with rage at what had passed, remained silent in tears, but on his departure said to him, Jacques, Jacques, you have not done well in thus dishonoring me. The blame, however, shall not be mine, but the whole be laid on you, if it please God my husband ever return. So that's what Froissart tells us is the event. And he kind of talks around it and then just brings us here. We have to kind of piece it together from what comes afterwards. So here is what all of that means, or what leads up to that event. Marguerite's testimony alleges that on the 18th of January, 1386, a man-at-arms, so not a knight, named Adam Louvel knocked on the chateau door, which Marguerite opened herself in the absence of servants. At this time, they are staying at in a city house. She and her mother-in-law have come into the city on business. Her mother-in-law is with friends. She is alone. Most of the servants are with her mother-in-law, Carouge's mother, and there's a knock on the door. She opens it. Louvel is there, and he makes inquiries about a loan that he owed to her husband, Jean de Carouge, and then suddenly announces that Jacques Legris was outside and insisted on seeing her. Marguerite says that she refused, and Louvel exclaimed that, but he loves you passionately. He will do anything for you, and he greatly desires to see you. Marguerite continued to protest that she did not wish to see him, and says that Legris himself then forced his way into the house and propositioned her, offering money if she would remain silent of their affair. So he basically wants her to sleep with him in return for his giving her money, which her husband desperately needs. When Marguerite refused, Legris then violently raped her with the aid of Louvel and threatened her not to tell anyone with what had occurred on pain of death. So this is a really ugly, ugly, sordid thing. Far more so than Boucicault saying that Italians are cowards. And again, this is not a matter of just a matter of honor. This is a matter of an actual crime, rape. So Marguerite remains silent of her ordeal until her husband returns on the 21st or 22nd of January. Upon hearing all this, as you might imagine, Carouge is not a happy man. So he summons his circle of friends, his mother, most of Marguerite's family, and they hold a council to determine what can be done and to get a notarized account from Marguerite. So she recounts all of the events as I just recited them to you. There's a legal clerk there to witness it. And Carouge immediately begins legal proceedings against Legris. Now, The problem with this, of course, is that you have to go to that person's liege lord. And especially in France, where everything is, with the aristocracy, is very much in this kind of bewildering set of feudal relationships. So he has to go to Count Pierre first, who is going to be the sole judge, jury on the whole thing. Now, he knows that's going to be a problem because Legree is beloved by Count Pierre, who doesn't like him at all. And indeed, Pierre does acquit Legree of all charges, and furthermore, accuses Marguerite of inventing or even dreaming the attack. He literally says that, I know that women have delicate natures and often have trouble doing things that men can do simply, like rousing themselves from sleep. So perhaps she was still in a dream state when she came to the door and basically hallucinated the whole thing, dreamt the whole thing. Okay? And then he even says that, we're one to want to pursue this. I really think that Legree might have counter charges of defamation that I would be willing to hear. And Legree says, no, my lord, that's okay. We don't have to do that. Now, here's the thing. Carrouge knows it's going to be a kangaroo court. He and Marguerite never even show up for the trial because they know it's going to be a sham. But he has to go through there before he can do what comes next, which is to go to Paris to appeal to the king. That's his one last chance of recourse, is the king and the parliament. So he knows that the problem is that the case depends on what? Marguerite's testimony, and that's it. So he develops a plan. Rather than trying to get the king to sit at a trial, he is going to get the king to agree that these are grounds for a trial by combat. It is now July by the time this happens. Okay, so we're what, 6 months in? And the second stage of the process begins, when Carrouge and Legree, with their followers, present themselves before the Parliament at the Palais de Justice to issue the formal challenge. This involves reciting the accusations and throwing down a gauntlet signifying their intention to fight. Declarations are pronounced in front of the king, his brother Louis of Valois, and the entire Parliament, who decided to initially hear the case as an ordinary criminal one and defer their decision on whether to permit the judicial duel until both sides had given testimony. So notice, there still has to be an investigation. I'm cutting this short, but basically the Parliament agrees that the Count of Alencon in no way really did anything to hold a proper inquiry. So they will hold an inquiry. Final reconciliation attempt. So now Legree holds a deaconate. So he's a deacon in the church, which is lay clergy. Some of his friends try to get him to insist on a church trial. So don't have the king try this. Appeal to have the bishop try it. There's no way, the church doesn't put people to death. So you'll avoid that if you are found guilty. You'll avoid the trial by combat. And Legree says, I'm not a coward. I have no problem with fighting him. They're not going to prove it. I'll fight him. And so he insists that it goes forward as a secular trial. Now he decides, however, to hit him with the defamation suit. And he wants 40,000 livres. To give you an idea what that turns into, and I went back and looked in the book, The Last Duel, and he's a little mushy about it. It's hard to assign worth in modern terms with medieval numbers. But basically, let's just say that it's more money than the already bankrupt Carrouge has, and it's probably more than his estate is worth. So essentially, were he to lose this and lose the counterclaim, he's going to lose everything. Or he can recant on his wife's behalf. And he says, no, absolutely not. I want to move forward with the case. So for pretty much the whole summer, this investigation goes on. And it remains a he said, she said, with Legree and Marguerite de Carrouge as principal witnesses. Finally, they track down Adam Lavelle and one of Marguerite's maidservants to give evidence. And because they are commoners testifying against nobles, and because this is France, they are put to the question under torture to make sure that they are telling the truth. Okay? During the process, neither produces evidence incriminating Legree, although there are significant problems with the timelines and details each produced being in conflict. Now, I don't want you to think that, they're put on the rack and broken and burned at the stake, but they are basically stretched or, dunked, etc. And so who knows how reliable the testimony is. But what comes out of this is that by the time they're trying to give them timelines, what Adam Lavelle says and what the maidservant says doesn't match each other, and they don't match either Legree or Marguerite. So now the quote-unquote witnesses have actually muddied things up worse. In addition, Lavelle is then subsequently challenged to a duel by Marguerite's cousin, Thomas de Bois. However, as Lavelle is a commoner and Thomas de Bois is not, this is dismissed. A aristocrat cannot challenge a commoner to a duel, and vice versa. All right, so here's what the court decides. Legree gives an alibi, and he sticks to it all summer long, which is that when the crime was committed, he could not have possibly been there because he was 25 miles away, and there's no way he could have ridden all the way there in the morning, ridden Marguerite, and then ridden back. Carouge says, no, that's BS. First of all, no one's proven you were where you said you were. Secondly, I am more than willing myself to make that exact same ride and prove that it could be done. And thirdly, what possible reason would my wife and I have to have the entire Kingdom of France know that she's been, that the baby that she's about to give birth to may not be mine, and that at best, everyone will know that she was raped. At worst, they'll believe she was a liar and we'll lose everything. So this is Carouge's rebuttal. Now, here's where the ugliness of medieval thought comes in, is that, remember I said the part about paternity wasn't a big part of the duel? Well, one of the arguments is, well, I don't even know that it's possible for a woman to get pregnant from being raped. Remember the infamous a few years ago, women's bodies have a way to shut that right down from, I think it was a Missouri senator. All right, well, he's got 14th century antecedents. So they then start calling in physicians and theologians to debate if pregnancy can indeed result from rape. And after differing opinions were given, I'm going to rock your world. The physician and the theologians had different positions on this topic. Decided that the matter was irrelevant to the trial because ultimately, now the reason they decide that is actually interesting and a little more complicated than it sounds. The reason it's irrelevant is that ultimately, under Catholic thought, children cannot inherit sins from their parents. So whether the kid is Legree's or Carouge's doesn't matter. The child is innocent of any crime, and the crime being investigated is rape. And whether the rape produces progeny or not, it's still a rape. So that's perhaps not as awful as it sounds, but what is awful is the fact that they then had a debate whether or not a woman could even get pregnant. So after submitting her to all of this, right? And by the way, by this point now, Marguerite has had the child. Okay, so now there's a baby with them in Paris, and they're stuck in Paris. It looks like they're going to decide that there's just not enough evidence to convict Legree, and then his alibi falls apart because the man who's providing it is a squire named Jean Belloteau, and he's arrested for what? Committing rape in Paris. And then under torture, he confesses to other rapes that he committed while in Legree's service, but keeps saying, but he did exactly what he said he would do, except that every time they put him back to the question, he gives different details about it. And then finally he recants and says, well, I'm not really sure what happened anymore. So basically the chief witness or the chief guy backing up the alibi is a rapist and is not a reliable witness. So there goes Legree's counter defense, or his defense. And so after 2 months, the Parliament decides that they can't come up with a clear decision under the methods given to men, and thus referred the matter to the court of God. All right, so here's the actual duel as we know it. It was decided that the coming combat would be located next to the walls of Saint-Martin-des-Champs. It was held in the presence of the king and the princes according to custom, and a huge crowd of common people assembled. Both men entered the lists ready for the uncertain trial of combat. Now when the marshal gave the signal for the attack, they drove their horses forward, let their lances of war drop, and proceeding at a gentle pace, they dashed against each other courageously and with spirit. In this first rush, the other man pierced Lord Jean's thigh with his lance, so the Greek hit first. And this blow would have done him much good if he had held the lance in that wound. But when he immediately drew it out, it was covered in blood, and the sight, rather than stunning the wounded man, made him bolder. Meanwhile, great horror paralyzed the spectators for a long time, and no one spoke or breathed, held as they were between hope and fear, until Jean gathered his strength and advancing shouted, "This day will decide our quarrel." With his left hand, he seized the top of his opponent's helmet and drew Jacques towards him, and then, pulling back a little, threw Jacques to the ground where he lay weighted down by his armor. Jean then threw his sword and killed his enemy, though with great difficulty because he was fully armored. Although the victor many times asked the defeated man while he was lying there to confess to the truth, the vanquished completely denied the event. But after all, he was condemned, according to the custom of the duel, to be hanged from a gibbet. Thus, the mother of errors, the stepmother of good counsel, rash cruelty occasioned this unjust duel. Afterwards, everyone found out who had committed the foul rape, when someone else confessed while being condemned to death. The aforesaid lady took note of this, and thinking over the fault in her mind, after the death of her husband, became a recluse and took an oath of perpetual continence. From the Chronicle of the Monks of St. Denis. Now, here's the problem. So here's what seems to have happened, right? They fight the duel. Carouge kills Legris. Legris will not confess because to what end? They're just going to hang him. And then later on, someone makes a deathbed confession. Marguerite says, "Oh my God, that's right," and goes in and becomes a recluse after her husband dies. Except that never happened. Never happened. The Chronicles of the Monks of St. Denis, who are the people who hosted the duel, ironically enough, is written decades after the events. And the accounts from the day and the right up until Carouge's death all end with Carouge pinning Legris to the ground, telling him to recant, and when he refuses, stabbing him repeatedly with the sword and killing him. This whole deathbed confession story never happened, or at least there is no accounts of it until decades after all the events were over. And it almost certainly comes from the fact that the people writing the Chronicle of the Monks of St. Denis at that point are, amongst other things, receiving endowments from members of the Legris family. And decades later, this is still a famous case in France. So it's an attempt, probably posthumously, to rehabilitate Legris's reputation that he was not a rapist. However, the problem is that for about 300 years, that becomes the official story, until in the early modern period, law students dig it back up and realize that it seems to be a completely invented rehabilitation decades after the events. So, all right, so who was the accuser? Well, in this case, it's a little bit more complicated. There's two. The accuser is Marguerite, and her husband, although he's the initial accuser, ultimately ends up acting as her champion. Who was the accused? The accused, obviously, was Jacques Legris. So I say the duel is, in a sense, more straightforward to the modern ideal of a duel, or even our idea of a court case, as the crime, accuser, and resolution are fairly straightforward and can be related to modern trials. Interestingly, French courts have retried this case multiple times throughout history, and despite a work in the 1880s by, yes, yet another descendant of Jacques Legris. This family really wants to get this off their family's name, in which the author attempted to prove his ancestors' innocence. They have sided with God's judgment, and more importantly, Marguerite, that Legris was most likely guilty based on the timelines, testimony, and problems with Legris' alibi. That includes things like sending people out to make the ride. Yep, you could do 25 miles there and back in the amount of time allotted. The fact that the person who supposedly saw him was unreliable, et cetera, et cetera. So this case has been tried and retried multiple times. And it continues to side that not because it was God's justice necessarily, but in this case, God's justice probably would have coincided with the modern courts. Now, and this is a teaser for a future lecture, it is worth noting that this is not the last judicial duel in France. The last judicial duel in France is the duel between Jarnac and Chataigneraie in 1547, which is also considered the birth of the formal duel of honor, the illicit duel of honor. It is merely the last duel in which a field was granted by the French Parliament instead of simply by the Crown. And the reason for that is that long before the judicial duel dies out in France, the French Parliament functionally dies out because absolutism is well in place by the early 16th century in France. All right, now, little epilogue. Carouge wins. I told you he died after 40 years of military exploits, and he died in battle. He dies in 1396 in the Battle of Nicopolis, which is a crusade led by the French against the Turks. That is a complete and total military fiasco, resulting in just thousands and thousands of French and German knights killed and a complete Turkish victory. Do you know who the leader of the battle, the French at the Battle of Nicopolis was? Why, that would be Jean Boucicaut, who himself was then captured and ransomed back to France and was rewarded by being made Marshal of France, the position that he held for his last great martial exploit, the Battle of Agincourt. So when I told you that the more he failed at things, the better his fortunes, that's exactly it. So there's an interesting connection between the two duels, that Carouge actually dies in Boucicaut's service. And Boucicaut goes off to lead that battle just after his fight with Galeazzo, because he's recalled from Italy for essentially having made a mess of things. So it's interesting that these two duels have a number of overlapping events. But that's what happens when you're dealing with, a class that is not quite 5% of the population too.